The town ladies ripped the obese girl's only dress, what the mountain man did that shocked everyone. The spring of 1847 brought more than wildflowers to the settlement of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory. It brought Clara Whitmore, though nobody wanted her there. She arrived on a supply wagon, squeezed between flour sacks and hardware crates, her considerable frame making the journey uncomfortable for everyone involved. The driver had complained the entire 3-day trek from Fort Laramie, and when they finally reached the cluster of rough buildings that passed for civilization, he couldn't unload her fast enough. Clara stepped down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much. At 23 years old and weighing well over 250 pounds, she'd learned that dignity was something other people possessed. She had only determination, and even that was wearing thin. The dress she wore, her only dress, was a patchwork affair made from flour sacks and donated fabric scraps. It strained across her middle and shoulders, the seams threatening to split with every breath. She'd sewn it herself during the winter, when her aunt had finally told her the truth. There was no money left, no future in Philadelphia, and no gentleman caller who would overlook her size. The only option was to come west to Bitter Creek, where her uncle ran the general store and might give her work in exchange for room and board. The town wasn't much to look at. A muddy main street ran between 2 rows of wooden buildings, the general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered beyond. Mountains rose in the distance, still capped with snow, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine and possibility. Clara gathered her carpet bag and started toward the general store. She'd made it perhaps 20 feet when she heard the laughter. 3 women stood outside the dry goods shop, their crisp calico dresses and carefully arranged hair marking them as the wives of important men. They stared at Clara with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed amusement. "Good Lord," one of them said, loud enough to carry. "What is that?" "It looks like someone tried to stuff a hog into a flour sack," another replied, and they dissolved into giggles. Clara kept walking, her face burning. She'd heard worse in Philadelphia. She'd survived worse. She could survive this. Her uncle's store was dim and cluttered inside, smelling of coffee and leather and tobacco. A thin man with gray whiskers looked up from behind the counter, his face falling when he saw her. "Clara," he said, as if hoping she might be someone else. "Uncle Joseph." She set down her bag. "Aunt Martha wrote that you might have work for me." He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Your aunt has a soft heart and no head for business. I can't afford to hire help, Clara. And even if I could," he gestured vaguely at her size, "the customers wouldn't stand for it. This is a respectable establishment." The words hit like physical blows, but Clara had learned not to flinch. "I could work in the back, sorting inventory. I wouldn't need much pay, just—" "No." Joseph's voice was firm. "I'm sorry, but no. You can stay in the back room for tonight, but tomorrow you'll need to find somewhere else." Clara nodded slowly. She'd expected disappointment, but she hadn't expected to be cast out before she'd even unpacked her bag. "Is there anyone else in town who might need help?" Joseph laughed without humor. "Clara, look at yourself. Who's going to hire you?" She spent that night on a pile of blankets in the storeroom, listening to mice scurry in the walls and wondering what she'd do when morning came. She had $7 to her name and no prospects whatsoever. The answer came at dawn, though not in the form she expected. A commotion outside woke her, raised voices and running feet. Clara emerged from the store to find half the town gathering in the street. A rider had come in from one of the mountain camps, bringing news that James Coulter needed supplies sent up to his cabin before the next snow. "Someone should tell him to come down here himself," one man grumbled. "I'm not climbing up that mountain for any amount of money." "Coulter doesn't come to town," someone else said. "Been 5 years since anyone's seen him down here. Longer, maybe." "Who's going to take his supplies up?" Silence fell. Everyone looked at everyone else, but nobody volunteered. Clara stepped forward. "I'll do it." The crowd turned to stare at her, and she felt the weight of their judgment like stones. "You," Joseph sputtered. "Clara, it's a 2-day journey. The trail is dangerous." "I can manage. I'm stronger than I look." So, this produced a round of skeptical laughter, but the rider, a grizzled man with a face like worn leather, studied her thoughtfully. "Coulter needs beans, coffee, flour, salt, and sugar. 100 pounds of supplies, give or take. Trail's steep but well marked. You think you can handle that, miss?" Clara knew she could. She'd carried heavy loads before, working in her aunt's boarding house. She might be fat, but she was strong. "Yes?" "Then the job's yours. Pays $5. $5. Combined with her savings, that might buy her a week's room and board, time enough to figure out something else. The town loaded the supplies onto a mule, along with a few items for Clara herself: bread, dried meat, a blanket. She set out that afternoon, following the narrow trail that wound up into the mountains. The first day was harder than she'd expected. The trail climbed steeply, switchbacking through stands of pine and aspen, and the thin mountain air left her gasping. But she pushed on, leading the mule, stopping frequently to rest but never turning back. She camped that night beside a stream, wrapped in her blanket, and tried not to think about how alone she was. The mountains were full of bears and mountain lions, or so she'd heard. But they didn't frighten her half as much as the prospect of returning to Bitter Creek in defeat. The second day brought her to higher elevations, where patches of snow still lingered in the shadows. The trail narrowed, running along the side of a rocky slope, and Clara had to concentrate on every step. The mule plodded behind her, sure-footed and patient. She reached the cabin in late afternoon. It sat in a small clearing, backed up against a cliff face, surrounded by towering pines. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a lean-to beside the cabin sheltered a pair of horses. Clara approached cautiously. "Hello, the cabin. I've brought supplies from town." The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a powerful build that spoke of years spent surviving in harsh conditions. His hair was long and dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his beard was neatly trimmed. He wore buckskin clothing and moccasins, and a knife hung at his belt. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "You're not the usual supply runner," he said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse. "No, sir. I'm Clara Whitmore. I'm new in town." "James Coulter." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You came all the way up here by yourself?" "Yes, sir." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "That's no easy journey. Let me help you unload." He moved with a fluid grace that surprised her, lifting the heavy sacks of supplies as if they weighed nothing. Clara tried to help, but he waved her off. "You've done your part getting them up here. Come inside. You'll need food and rest before you head back down." The cabin's interior was surprisingly neat. A single large room with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves lined with books and various tools and equipment hung on the walls. A bearskin rug covered the floor, and herbs hung drying from the rafters. Coulter set about preparing a meal while Clara sat at the table, grateful to be off her feet. He moved efficiently around the small space, and soon the cabin filled with the smell of frying meat and biscuits. "Why'd they send you?" he asked without turning around. "Town usually sends Porter or one of the other men." "Nobody else wanted to come. They're all afraid of you?" He glanced back at her, one eyebrow raised. "And you're not?" "I'm more afraid of starving." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first expression she'd seen from him beyond neutral assessment. Fair enough. They ate in comfortable silence. The food was simple but good, and Clara ate more than she should have, unable to help herself. She waited for Coulter to comment on her appetite, to make some joke about her size, but he said nothing. He simply passed her more biscuits when her plate was empty. "You can sleep there," he said afterward, gesturing to the bed. "I'll take the floor." "I can't take your bed." "Trail's dangerous in the dark. You'll leave in the morning." Clara wanted to argue, but exhaustion overwhelmed her objections. She lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, and fell asleep to the sound of Coulter moving quietly around the cabin. She woke before dawn to find him already up, packing supplies into a leather bag. He saw her stirring and set a plate of food on the table. "Eat. I'm going down to town with you." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." His tone brooked no argument. They descended the mountain together, Coulter leading the way with the easy confidence of someone who knew every rock and root on the trail. He didn't try to make conversation, for which Clara was grateful. The journey took less time going down, and they reached Bitter Creek by mid-afternoon. The town fell silent when they walked down the main street. People stared openly at the mountain man, who hadn't been seen in town for years, and at the fat girl walking beside him. Coulter stopped at the general store. "You," he said to Joseph. "Pay her." Joseph scrambled to count out $5, his hands shaking slightly. "Where's she staying?" Coulter asked. She was in the back room, but not anymore." Coulter turned to Clara. "Get your things." She retrieved her carpet bag, confused and uncertain about what was happening. When she emerged, Coulter was talking to the proprietor of the boarding house, a nervous little man who kept nodding and agreeing to whatever the mountain man said. "You've got a room now," Coulter told her. "Paid for the month." "I can't let you. You earned it. Did the job nobody else would do." He studied her face for a moment, something like approval in his eyes. "You've got spine, Clara Whitmore. Don't let this town convince you otherwise." Then he walked away, heading back toward the mountains, and the crowd parted before him like water before a ship. Clara stood in the street, holding her carpet bag, trying to understand what had just happened. A legendary mountain man, someone the whole town feared, had just shown her more kindness than anyone else in her entire life. The next week settled into a pattern. Clara found work helping the boarding house keeper with laundry and cooking in exchange for her meals. The town's women still whispered and laughed when she passed, but she ignored them. She had a roof over her head and enough to eat. For now, that was enough. She thought about Coulter often, wondering about the man who lived alone in the mountains. Why had he helped her? What had he seen in her that made him think she deserved kindness? The answer came 6 weeks later, on a sunny morning when the town ladies decided they'd had enough of Clara Whitmore. She was walking back from the well, carrying 2 heavy buckets of water, when they surrounded her. Margaret Walsh, Constance Porter, and Sarah Jenkins, the 3 women who'd mocked her on her first day in town. "We've been talking," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "And we've decided that someone who looks like you shouldn't be walking around town in decent people's sight." "I'm just fetching water." "You're an eyesore," Constance interrupted. "And that dress is an insult to every respectable woman in Bitter Creek." Clara looked down at her flour sack dress, the only one she owned. "I'm sorry it offends you, but—" "Sorry isn't good enough," Sarah said. "We won't have someone like you embarrassing this town." Before Clara could react, Margaret grabbed the front of her dress and yanked hard. The already strained seams gave way with a terrible ripping sound. Constance and Sarah joined in, pulling and tearing, and within seconds, Clara's dress was in tatters. She stood in the street, exposed in her threadbare undergarments, while the 3 women laughed. "There," Margaret said. "Now everyone can see what you really are." Clara wanted to disappear. She wanted to die. She stood frozen, unable to move or speak, while people emerged from shops and houses to stare. Then a voice cut through the laughter, deep and cold as winter wind. "What's happening here?" James Coulter stood at the end of the street, his expression thunderous. The town ladies fell silent. Margaret's face went pale. Coulter walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped in front of Clara and removed his buckskin shirt, revealing a scarred but powerful chest. He draped the shirt around her shoulders, covering her. Then he turned to face the 3 women. "You did this," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She doesn't belong here," Margaret stammered. "She's not one of us." "No," Coulter agreed. "She's worth 10 of you." He looked at the gathered crowd. 6 weeks ago, this woman did something none of you would do. She made a dangerous journey to help a stranger. She worked hard. She earned her place here. His eyes returned to the three women. And you destroyed the only dress she owned because you're small, cruel people who need to hurt others to feel important. Now see here, Margaret's husband blustered, pushing through the crowd. You can't talk to my wife that way. Coulter's glare silenced him. Your wife just humiliated an innocent woman in the street. If you had any decency, you'd be ashamed of her. He turned back to Clara. Come with me. Still wearing his shirt, which hung on her like a tent, Clara followed Coulter to the general store. Her Uncle Joseph looked terrified when they entered. I need cloth, Coulter said. Good cloth, enough to make 3 dresses. Yes, of course. And thread, needles, whatever else she needs. He pulled out a leather pouch and emptied gold coins onto the counter, more money than Clara had ever seen at once. Whatever she needs, he repeated. Joseph scrambled to gather bolts of fabric, calico, muslin, even a blue cotton that Clara had admired in the window but never dreamed of owning. Can you sew? Coulter asked her. Yes, I made my... She gestured at the ruined dress. I made that one. Good. Make yourself better ones. He turned to Joseph. She'll need other things too. Shoes, a coat. Make a list. Mr. Coulter, I can't accept all this. You can and you will. He looked at her and his expression softened slightly. Clara, let me tell you something. 5 years ago, I lost my wife and daughter to sickness. Couldn't save them, couldn't help them, couldn't do a damn thing but watch them die. After that, I went up into those mountains because I couldn't stand being around people anymore. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But you reminded me that not everyone's worth avoiding. You did an honest job for honest pay. You didn't complain or quit when it got hard. And those women out there destroyed your dignity because they have none of their own. He gestured at the fabric. So take this, make yourself dresses, and hold your head high, because you got more character in your little finger than this whole town combined. Clara felt tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet. I'm not done. He raised his voice so Joseph and the growing crowd outside could hear. Anyone who mistreats this woman answers to me. Anyone who mocks her, anyone who hurts her, anyone who makes her life harder than it needs to be, they'll have me to deal with. And I promise you, you don't want that. The threat hung in the air, undeniable. Coulter helped Clara carry her purchases to the boarding house, then tipped his hat. I'll be back in a few weeks to check on you. If anyone gives you trouble before then, send word up the mountain. Wait, Clara said. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a long moment. Because someone should have done it for my daughter. Because you deserve better than you've been given. And because I'm tired of good people suffering while cruel ones prosper. Then he left, heading back to his mountain, and Clara stood surrounded by beautiful fabric, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The next months brought changes to Bitter Creek. The town ladies never apologized, but they stopped their open mockery. Other people, those who'd watched the confrontation, began treating Clara with something approaching respect. The blacksmith's wife hired her to help with washing. The schoolteacher asked her to assist with the younger children. Clara made herself 3 beautiful dresses from the fabric Coulter had bought. She wore them with pride, and if people stared, let them stare. She'd survived worse than judgment. Coulter came to town every few weeks, always stopping to check on her, always bringing small gifts. A book, a bag of coffee, once a beautiful shawl made of soft wool. They would talk for hours sitting outside the boarding house, and Clara discovered that beneath the gruff exterior was a kind, thoughtful man who'd been broken by loss, but was slowly healing. You should come up to the cabin sometime, he said one afternoon. It's beautiful in the summer. Meadows full of wildflowers, clear streams, peace and quiet. "I'd like that," Clara said, and she meant it. The invitation came in early July. Coulter arrived in town with a pack horse and a week's worth of supplies. "Come up the mountain with me," he said. "Stay a few days. See what you think." The boarding house keeper could spare her, so Clara packed a bag and made the journey up to Coulter's cabin. This time the trail seemed easier, familiar, and she found herself enjoying the climb. The cabin was exactly as she remembered, but now she saw it with new eyes, saw how Coulter had created a home here, how every item had its place and purpose. He'd added flowers in pots by the door, and she suspected he'd done it for her. They spent 3 days together, and they were the happiest days of Clara's life. They talked and laughed and shared meals. Coulter taught her to fish in the stream and to identify animal tracks. She cooked for him and mended his clothes and felt for the first time ever that she belonged somewhere. On the third evening, sitting outside the cabin and watching the sun set behind the mountains, Coulter took her hand. "I'm going to say something," he began, "and you can tell me I'm a fool if you want." "What is it?" "I'm 52 years old, Clara. I'm not refined or educated. I live in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and I'm better with animals than people. But I've come to care for you. More than care, I love you. You're brave and kind and strong, and being around you makes me remember what it's like to be happy." Clara's heart pounded. "James, let me finish. I know what I'm offering isn't much. Life up here is hard. Winters are brutal. You'd be isolated from town. But if you'd have me, I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel unwanted again. I'd build you whatever you needed. We could expand the cabin, maybe get some chickens, a cow, make this a real home." He turned to face her fully. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me?" She should have been surprised, but somehow she wasn't. Everything had been leading to this moment, from her first journey up the mountain to this evening, watching the light fade from the sky. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and tentative, and Clara felt something inside her unfold like a flower opening to the sun. They were married a month later in Bitter Creek's small church. The whole town attended, though whether from respect or curiosity, Clara couldn't say. She wore her best blue dress and carried wildflowers. Coulter wore new buckskins and looked terrified. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Margaret Walsh opened her mouth, but her husband clapped a hand over it and shook his head frantically. Clara and James Coulter returned to the mountain cabin as husband and wife. True to his word, James expanded the cabin, adding a room for storage and a covered porch. They got chickens and a milk cow. They planted a garden. They built a life together. Clara never became thin. Her body remained large and soft, and she never apologized for it again. James loved her exactly as she was, loved the way she filled his arms when he held her, loved her strength and determination, loved the sound of her laughter echoing through the cabin. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both healthy and strong. Clara taught them to read and to sew and to stand up for themselves. James taught them to hunt and fish and to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance. The town ladies never quite forgave Clara for landing a man like James Coulter, but she didn't care. She had everything she needed in her mountain home: love, respect, and the knowledge that she'd found where she truly belonged. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, James would pull her close and say, "Best day of my life was when you showed up at my door with those supplies. Changed everything." And Clara would smile and reply, "Mine too." Because it was true. The journey up that mountain had led her home, not to a place, but to a person who saw her worth when no one else did. And that made all the difference. Years later, when their children were grown, travelers would sometimes stop at the Coulter cabin seeking directions or help. They'd find a large, happy woman with graying hair and a tall, weathered man with kind eyes. And if those travelers had come from Bitter Creek, they'd tell stories about the legendary mountain man and his wife, about how she'd walked into town with nothing and left with everything. about how he'd defended her honor against the whole town, about how their love had become the stuff of legend. But Clara and James paid no attention to stories. They were too busy living their own tale, one that had started with cruelty and loneliness but had ended in joy and belonging. And that, they both agreed, was the only story that mattered.